On behalf of the Einaudi Center for International Studies, thank you for joining for this postdoctoral symposium on future directions in the study of migration and racial justice. I'm truly excited and honored to be here today because we have this incredible set of brilliant scholars, and we have the opportunity to learn from the way in which their work intersects, the way in which they are pushing forward agendas both individually and collectively on identity, colonialism and decolonization, indigeneity and dispossession, refugee studies and mobility, economic and social justice, and critical race theory. So the goal, I think, is threefold for us today. First of all, for us to give them incredible feedback, questions, ways of advancing their own projects. Secondly, so that we ourselves are intellectually enriched by their expertise, and so that we all continue to grow from their insights. And thirdly, to create a conversation. It's already been done in many ways with the Migrations Initiative, with our Global Racial Justice Initiative, but by bringing these conversations together continually, we're able to be more than sum of the parts, to really allow this kind of crosstalk and to see the points of relation and imagine new futures in these directions. I would also really like to thank the Society for the Humanities and Director Paul Fleming in particular for their support, and especially to note that two of our postdoctoral fellows here today are hosted at the Society. I would also like to give a very warm welcome to today's moderator for the symposium, Dr. Viranjini Munasinghe, a professor in the Department of Anthropology, whose research expertise is based in the Caribbean, Trinidad in particular, the Asian diaspora, and in the Americas. Her initial research focused on the relationship between ethnicity and nationalism and the politics of exclusion in nation-building projects. She is also interested in epistemological issues having to do with the articulation of certain theoretical concepts, those that we'll be really engaging with today, in terms of concepts like race, ethnicity, and nation, with their lay and political discursive forms and the implications of such entanglements for disciplines, for theory, and for politics. We're so glad to have her with us today to lead this conversation. Before I hand it over to her, I would like to start us off with Cornell University's land acknowledgement, which is to say that Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, and the Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of this university, of New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayakono dispossession and honor their ongoing connection of the people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Thank you so much, and now I'm turning it over to Viranjini.
Thank you. So I would also like to extend a warm welcome to both our audiences, virtual and in person, and this really exciting symposium hosted by the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies, and which is also co-sponsored by the Society for Humanities. Before proceeding, I would like to say a really warm, sorry. I thought I didn't. Oh, that's a good idea. Oh, sorry about it. I'll just keep going, I think. Anyway, before proceeding, I would like to thank Professor Rachel Beatty Riedl for including me in this event. I'm really looking forward to it, and also really big thank you to Rachel, who just did a marvelous job, I think, coordinating all this. So thank you both. So today's event on future directions in the study of migration and racial justice, a postdoctoral symposium combines 2 major research priorities of the Einaudi Center: migrations and global racial justice. Okay. two major research priorities of the Einaudi Center, migrations and global racial justice. We aim to engage publics and transform the world. We are fortunate to have a gloriously interdisciplinary panel, I think, present their really groundbreaking research on these pressing global issues relating to migration and global racial justice. Just a word about the format. I would like to introduce all the speakers, at once, and then they will present. And at the end, I would like to pose the questions on the in-person audience first, and then turn to the virtual audience, if that's all okay with you. Okay. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. The first speaker is Dr. Mohamed Abdul, who is a global racial justice postdoctoral fellow at the Mario Einaudi Center. Dr. Abdou received his PhD in cultural studies from Queen's University, and he's also an assistant professor of sociology at the American University in Cairo. Dr. Abdou is an interdisciplinary scholar of indigenous, Black, critical race, and Islamic studies, as well as gender, sexuality, women's studies, and decolonization. And he has also conducted extensive fieldwork in the Middle East, North Africa, and Turtle Island. He's the author of the forthcoming book by Pluto Press, Islam and Anarchism, Relationships and Resonances. Sounds incredibly important and exciting and intriguing. Our second speaker is Dr. Emman Ganayem, who is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Comparative Literature and Society for the Humanities. She earned her PhD in English with minor degrees in American Indian Studies and Gender and Women's Studies from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she was also the 2020-2021 Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Asian American Studies. Dr. Ghanayem's current book project argues that indigeneity, as expressed in American Indian and Palestinian literatures, offers a necessary critique of settler nationalism as a product of the colonial West, as well as represents an alternative form of belonging that is land-oriented, relational, and can function without a state. The title of Dr. Ghanayem's presentation is Being Native, Being Refugee. Bamba Ndiaye, who is our third speaker, is also a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Music and Society for the Humanities. Dr. Ndiaye has a PhD in comparative humanities from the University of Louisville, and his research centers on Black Atlantic social movements, critical race theory, Black Atlantic popular cultures, mobility, and Pan-Africanism. He is currently working on his book manuscript entitled Black Social Movements in the Digital Era. The title of Dr. Ndiaye's presentation is From Mbasmi to Mbekmi, right? Mbasmi to Mbekmi, COVID-induced migration and social movement advocacy in Senegal. Eleanor Painter is our fourth speaker, and she is a Migrations Initiative postdoctoral fellow at the Mario Einaudi Center. Dr. Painter works in critical refugee studies. Focusing on the Black Mediterranean, her work responds to anti-immigrant racism and post-colonial border dynamics. Her current book project, Emergency in Transit, examines migration from Africa to Europe via the Mediterranean Sea, drawing on migrant testimonies produced in Italy to reconsider the common framing of irregular migration as a crisis of emergency. Dr. Painter's presentation is titled Witnessing Migration Crises, in colons, Race, Coloniality, and Asylum in Italy. Now, for our final speaker is Grace Tran, who is also a Migrations Initiative postdoctoral fellow at the Mario Einaudi Center. Dr. Tran holds a PhD in criminology and sociolegal studies from the University of Toronto. Her work examines how contours of belonging, morality, gender, intimacy, and identity intersect with understandings of migration and citizenship. Dr. Tran's advocacy, writing, and research interests stem from her experience working at an immigration law and consulting firm, and from the nexus of disruption, resettlement, opportunity, and overwhelm that shaped her parents' own diasporic journey as Vietnamese both people refugees. Dr. Tran's paper is entitled, "What's Love Got to Do with It? Transformative Effects of Vietnamese American Engagement in Marriage Fraud Arrangement." Thank you, and I will now turn the floor to Dr. Abdou.
Thank you very much, and I'm very grateful for Einaudi, as well as the Society for Humanities, all the audience, online and offline, as well as my fellow colleagues, as well as the technical assistants, as well as, well, let me start off again. I'm very thankful for Einaudi, as well as the technical assistants, my fellow colleagues, our wonderful moderator. Thank you very much. I'm deeply humbled and honored to be amongst you all today. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. My discussion today, or a brief sort of foray into what it is that I'm interested in exploring during my postdoc, actually builds off my master's and my PhD work. As had been noted, my master's thesis was on Islam and anarchism, its forthcoming book, and it's based on the premise that there is no separation between, one cannot understand race without religion, as Soviet Jean Malik, as well as Saad Abdel-Kabir had noted. 1492 is a very significant date, historically speaking, not only because of Turtle Island, because of the eviction of Muslims and Jews from Andalusia in Spain. Muslims and Jews are referred to as heathens, savages, and various words to stand to the same casting aspersions, savages, and so on and so forth, upon indigenous people and Black people. Furthermore, a third to a fifth of the transatlantic slaves of the Middle Passage slaves from the Iberian Peninsula were Muslims, forcibly converted. So building on these premises that one cannot really conceptualize race in the contemporary without also addressing spirituality, and he's coming out of the spiritual closet, as Jackie M. Alexander had noted, Bell Hooks, and many others, it becomes quite vital to the work that I do. And the significance of 1492, particularly in the era of Islamophobia, settler colonialism in the context of Palestine, an Orientalized Arab Spring Islamist winter that I participated in, and generally social movements, post-Seattle globalization, that I've also been a part of, whether it's the Mohawks in Tantanega and radical Black movements as well. So in my particular work, then, that makes the emphasis on political theology very important. And in my PhD, I explored the subject of queer Muslims, queer Egyptians in particular, Nubian, Sudanese Egyptians, given the hypervisibility and invisibility of Blackness globally, and really putting queer Muslims in conversation within the context of Egypt, in conversation with queer Indigenous and queer Black studies over here, given the disconnect in conversations that happened and anti-Blackness that exists within Swana communities in general. But the general absence also of queer Muslims within Turtle Island as diasporas, as arrivals, of actually addressing their complicity within settler colonialism. So settler colonialism, as much as political theology, become very, very important theoretical sort of frameworks which I engage in as well. Insofar as Islam and anarchism and my work in general, I usually deal with the Quran explicitly, as well as the prophetic oral tradition, insofar as the Sunnah and the Hadith. So the prophetic practice, as well as the Hadith, the Sunnah, from which the Sunnah is derived from. The relevance of that is that any Muslim or non-Muslim will come and say, well, show me where God says in the Quran that I need to be anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian, sexist, anti-racist, and so on and so forth. So anarcha-Islam, what I refer to it as an Islamic interpretation of anarchism and an anarchistic interpretation of Islam vis-a-vis the Quran. Indigeneity becomes a very important concept, as Dr. Beatty Riedl had mentioned, in decolonization in general, simply because also my involvement within radical Indigenous and Black traditions, or particularly Indigenous traditions insofar as how they conceptualize indigeneity. So I read it as a non-racial and non-ethnic concept, right? It doesn't refer to, as Philip Deloria would say, as being Indian, no return to innocence, race innocence narratives, as Shireen Marzak would note either. It's mostly synonymous with the concept of what I associate, the concept, the spiritual concept of fitra, which to me I associate indigeneity as very much also having to contend with spirituality and grounded normative practices, as Glenn Coulthard would note it, and Leanne Simpson as well. Janet Armstrong, Okanagan scholar Janet Armstrong, notes that through sacred activism and spiritual paths of service, indigeneity can become a social ethic in which life practices intent on indigenous technology and knowledge of the land's local realities and regenerative capacity become the guiding force for human occupation. Elder Robert Loveless similarly notes that indigeneity or becoming indigenous isn't synonymous, nor is it a political euphemism for Aboriginal, Native, or Indian. It doesn't follow from multicultural liberal UN declarations or articles or racial definitions of indigenous people per se. Loveless states re-indigenization and indigeneity entail a return to the expectations of the womb, and every infant in the womb has an expectation that he or she will emerge into the early indigenous world that responds to the Islamic concept, like I said, of fitra. We're all born with this fitra. So it's not about bloodline, skin color, or cultural heritage. And fitra is synonymous with acts of compassion, insofar as rahma, the Islamic concept of rahma, goodness, ihsan, and intelligence, but particularly again rooted very much in land and communal responsibilities towards land in an anti-authoritarian way. My goal then is working through decolonial understandings of Muslim concepts of sovereignty as well as indigenous, the original Medina Charter upon which the original polity of the Ummah, the global community of Muslims and non-Muslims, in unison with one another, be it Christian, Jews, Sabians, Buddhists, Zoroastrian, and even pagans, informed the Ummah, and that was informed by the Medina Charter that established and egalitarian relationships between all these communities, so much as they're all grounded together in sort of ethical, political commitments insofar as that they're different paths to the same creator. Sovereignty lied with the Ummah during the so-called pre-modern period or the pre-industrial period, but in more specific and nuanced terms, not what is referred to as the dawla. The dawla, unfortunately, is the Arab term, Muslim term that Arabs have misconstrued because dawla does not actually originally mean state, as Tamim Barghouti, the son of Rabi Barghouti, a Palestinian scholar, had noted in his book, The Ummah and the Dawla. The dawla, by definition, cannot inform an ummah. Muslim societies in pre-modern area were resembled a confederacy. And so in so many matters of, insofar as many matters of organization, there could have existed multiple dawlas equally operating at the same time within the context of the Ummah, but none of them ever really held sway or hegemony. The word dawla itself emerges from the Quranic term, or falls between two verbs, dal, between the verbs dal, to go away, and dar, to rotate. Unfortunately, Muslims did not have a word, or Arabs did not have a word for state, so we used this word from the Quran, and we began to use it as synonymous in the contemporary for the state. So, again, dawla is used in two verses in the Quran. It was used in the context of the distribution of the spoils of war, in Surah Al-Hashr, or the gathering, verse 7, that wealth circulates amongst the community, and also in the context of one's health. One has health one day, and another day one's health subsides. So yeah, that is the context of dawla. Ummah, on the other hand, according to Lisan al-Arab, completed in 1290 by Ibn Manzur, emanated from the root M, which
Place
means
another Jabra Speak 710 nearby.
to head or to quest or to lead or to guide in a certain sense. And as Tamim al-Barghouti writes, it follows itself, and the Ummah follows itself and follows an image of itself, yet it and its image are at least etymologically one. Abraham is referred to as an Ummah unto himself, but so are the plants, the animals that inform creation, that are considered to be an Ummah as they describe unto themselves, as the Quran says in chapter 6, verse 37. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the Creator says, there is no creature moving on earth nor a bird flying on its two wings, but they are all communities and ummah like you. We have not missed anything in this book. Then to their Lord, all of them shall be gathered. So the consequence, unfortunately, of Sykes-Picot, of the adoption of the Westphalian sort of order, is ostensibly the fact that we have two contradictory loyalties, foci of loyalty, to mutually exclusive images that are being served, a double consciousness in Du Boisian terms that are conflicting, the colonial definition of Arabs and Muslims, that has been part of the struggle, the nation state, loyalty to Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, Qatar, Syria, Lebanon, and so on and so forth, and a loyalty to a larger, grander project. Of course, Arabs Arabized in a secular fashion the notion of the Ummah to try and incept an Arab Ummah, but this is where decolonization has a role to play insofar as trying to envision what an Ummah that coalesces, conjoins, both Muslims and non-Muslims alike, in a pluriverse vision, if you will, could look like, absent of border imperialism, absent of colonialism and imperialism that defines these borders. I don't want to take too much time, but Islam very much also distinguishes between the concepts of spirituality, Iman, known as faith, ruhaniya, spirituality, and deen, religion. In Islam, there's no coercion in religion, and Allah acknowledges, of course, in the Quran, had the Lord will, had God will, all those on earth would have believed altogether. وَخَلَقْنَاكُمْ مِنْ شُعُوبٍ وَقَبَائِلَ, as the Quran says, وَأَحْسَنَكُمْ عَلَى اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. So the best amongst you, as we have created you of different tribes and people, are those who practice taqwa, as in adhere to ethical and political commitments as defined by Creator towards, again, each other and to non-human life. Because there is no compulsion in religion. And in so many ways, I feel that these ontological, epistemological commitments, perhaps, very much coincide not only with colonial Islamic anarchistic, not necessarily anarchist, but anarchistic anti-authoritarian perspectives and agendas, but very much with indigenous scholarship that has had to highlight responsibilities insofar as land and non-human life, indigenous sovereignty, as Glenn Coulthard, as Robert Lovelace, as Liam Simpson that I had noticed, but also anarcho-indigenism and resurgence in general, insofar as indigenous transnationalism, and trying to begin to imagine or to redream dangerously a world without states, a world without capitalism, without poverty, and generally without oppression. While maintaining the politics of responsibility that we have to one another, as the Quran would say, as khalifs, because khalif is unfortunately usually taken in the singular term, but the Quran refers to it in the pluralistic term, insofar as we are all khulafa, or caretakers of one another and non-human life. So again, thank you very much for your time and your patience and your audience, and I'm very humbled and honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we move to Dr. Ghanayem's presentation.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here and for the 61 people over Zoom. I want to thank the Einaudi Center for extending an invitation for the fellows from the society. So the title of my presentation, being Native, being Refugee, speaks of a missed intersectionality in the study of indigeneity and dispossession. In the legal language of state governments and international organizations, no group of people in the world is recognized as both indigenous and refugee. That means that no group is treated as deserving of rights and protections under both of these headings. This is part of a larger social problem that exists on a global scale. It is also an intellectual problem, evident in the separation that exists between the study of Native experiences and the study of refugee experiences. So I think the subject matter is very relevant to the theme of this panel, and I put together a super short presentation to talk more about this with you today. But I'm happy during Q&A to also answer questions about how I explore that more in my material ways in my research. So my entry point is the United Nations. The United Nations does not recognize any people in the world as both refugee and indigenous. Considering the very wide use and significance of intersectionality, a theory that helps us recognize the multiplicity of social existence and brings to light invisible subjects and narratives, this UN misrecognition or lack of it thereof comes with grave implications. And for those who don't know, intersectionality is a theory created by Black woman legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw to talk about how legal discourse or legal language separates matters of race from matters of gender, which renders Black women invisible. And so this theory becomes very relevant for a lot of folks working in ethnic studies or critical race studies and indigenous studies and so on and so forth. And in this example particularly, it's also a missed opportunity to understand refugee and indigenous experiences together. By not recognizing refugees as a displaced native population, the UN is denying the fact that refugees come from a specific place and are deeply bound to that place. In fact, a generally established distinction between the refugee and other comparable figures like the migrant or the citizen lies in the former's loss of their native place of belonging, a historical and cultural home they did not want to leave. Regardless of the reasons that caused it, refugees' loss of their homes is a non-choice, a literal and unforeseen uprooting, an existential rupture that changes everything they know. Despite this popular perception of the refugee and their perception of themselves, institutions like the United Nations are mainly concerned with the project of resettling refugees in countries that could naturalize them anew, or at minimum could alleviate their needs for basic resources temporarily. Such bureaucratic approach sees in transferring refugees into a new country a corrective strategy of some sort, a fair compensation for losing one's access to everything they and their parents before them had. The logic here is that if refugees lost their country, and by extension their citizenship, then funding them another country solves the problem. This pragmatic perspective understands belonging purely in these terms and in country, status, nationalist terms, and by doing so compromises the fundamental relationship between refugees and the homes they just lost. In other words, to the UN and similar institutions, the strong connection to homeland, the very heart of refugee struggle, is made tragically invisible. So the history of how the United Nations has handled the affairs of indigenous peoples, and that's on the other side of things, also contains harmful erasures. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, a document that took a coalition of indigenous peoples decades to finally get on the table of the World's General Assembly, lacks an intersectional awareness akin to the UN's accenting of refugee nativehood. One primary example is the elusive, very ambiguous reference to return in the written text of UNDRIP. Return, a term often associated with refugee narratives, signifies the process of going back home after a forced removal. In the context of colonization, return also connotes a transformative action that requires colonial reversals, an end to the cycle of displacement and admittance of guilt through amends, which makes sense why they would not necessarily recognize it in material ways. The UNDRIP does not shy away from admitting to indigenous displacement and their history of removals, their loss of land and resources, and their strive for political sovereignty. It should come to no surprise that the document avoids phrasing return as an action verb. It never says we will return them or we will commit to them returning, but talks about it in very ambiguous terms and oftentimes frames it as optional, as though they have the option. More significantly, they being, the displaced indigenous persons or peoples. More significantly, to my purposes here, the document also obscures the fact that indigenous peoples struggle with colonization, and their desire for return still circulate to this day. So it's often spoken of in very, old past terms. Natives are admittingly grounded figures, anchored as they are in their cultural and traditional practices, hence the use of the word indigenous, which connotes this rootedness, but they are also transitory, displaced, striving for restorative movement and a fuller sense of home. In that sense, they are also refugee in the technical sense, the figurative sense of the word. I referenced the UN's erasure of the overlap between indigenous and refugee experiences to showcase the current state of the global language around them. It is a language that assumes a certain legality to define a crisis, establish victimhood, and propose interventions that are bureaucratized and managed through separated classifications. To a large extent, the UN's treatment of refugee and indigenous narratives serves as a metaphor for the limitation of classifying human experience, which is particularly difficult to do in the context of colonialism. Entering the domain of literary criticism, which is my discipline and my focus, the focus of my work, we see similar problems around the classification of refugee literature. This becomes the issue of categorization, becomes also an issue of genre. Often perceived as autonomous and self-explanatory, the genre of refugee literature is overdetermined by what we purely perceive to be a refugee story, a story that often unfolds linearly as it centers crisis. For readers, the plot comes to life as the tumultuous event of the characters becoming refugee unfolds, with occasional but very minimal flashbacks to what life was like before. And though the genre itself is expanding, with the expansion of the term itself to include climate refugees and those displaced by environmental crises, many literary critics still maintain a constrictive idea of what a refugee is, with little to no interest in what the refugee was or the perpetrators who made them that way. Both sides of classification, UN policy, and literary canonization have yet to contend with the indigenous subtext that informs refugee feelings, thinking, and political struggle. There also needs to be a true recognition of the colonial conditions, the real, the present, the continuing, that have always turned the historically homebound into the newly displaced. Refugee literatures and indigenous literatures, and more generally narratives, should not only be understood as comparable for these reasons, but also intersectional or even as related parts in the same or a similar plotline. In my research, I understand these rigid classifications as revealing a certain form of social invisibility and as continuing in the long tradition of colonial erasure. I call the conditions of refugee and indigenous displacements colonial because of how colonization, by its very definition, is a project of dispossession. Whether that colonial intent defines itself as such or comes from internal or foreign forces, it unquestionably exerts itself on the most vulnerable in pursuit of power, may it be ethnic, hegemonic, or of an imperial nature. It also always leads to displacing people and destabilizing their lives. The overlap between the native and the refugee and their connection to colonial dispossession is most illuminated in the example of indigenous populations displaced by what we now define as settler colonialism. A particular but representative brand of colonialism, settler colonialism's quintessential function is to settle on an already inhabited land, replace an indigenous population through violent means, create a new national origin story that erases indigenous presence, and build institutions, legal, cultural, academic, etc., that are meant to disseminate its false narrative and maintain the process of settlement. Displacement caused by settler colonialism allows us to trouble the canonical border between refugee and indigenous narratives. It also allows us to read literature and story in very, and I mean it in very general terms. So, you know, that bleeds into not only literary studies, but, you know, everything, you know, story circuits and everything. It also allows us to read literature in a more, and story in a more nuanced way, in an intersectional way that observes overlap, and in a relational way that understands settler colonialism as a global phenomenon that creates comparable realities. Two major examples that can fulfill this pursuit are found in Palestinian and American Indian writings. Palestinian and American Indian literatures present two case studies in which the overlap between refugee and indigenous writings appears very clearly. They attest to the duality of being both native and refugee, the relationship between feeling displaced and bound at the same time, which always functions for these two peoples as an ongoing contradiction and an affect, and the tension between the two. In the two examples of Palestinian and American Indian writings, we can see how refugees can also be indigenous people can also be refugee. Erasing the intersection of the two results in telling an incomplete story of who they are, where they come from, where they are now, and what caused this violent transition.
Now we turn the floor to Dr. Ndiaye.
Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you very much to the Einaudi Center for associating me to this symposium. It's a pleasure to share part of my research. And my talk today is titled From Basmi to Mbekmi, COVID-induced migration and social movement advocacy in Senegal. And this is part of a larger project that I am co-authoring with a peer at Boston University, Margaret Rowley. And the term, I guess it would be important also to clarify some of the terminologies. Mbasmi means the epidemic in Wolof, which is one of the major local languages in Senegal. And the term Mbekmi means pirogue migration, or some people call it irregular migration or clandestine migration. So that uses pirogues to use the Atlantic route from West Africa, the coast of West Africa, to most of the time the Canary Islands. So on the night of October 26, 2020, a Senegalese Navy boat collided with a Spain-bound pirogue transporting about 159 people. While the Navy was able to save 66 people, the remainder of the embarkation perished in the ocean. A few weeks later, the Senegalese news source Seneweb reported that 11 members of the same family from Tivaouane, including a child, also perished in the ocean while attempting to reach the coast of Europe. These two examples are part of a new series of tragedies involving young Senegalese trying to find a better life for themselves and for their families in Europe. The COVID-19 global pandemic has exacerbated an already precarious economic situation in West Africa. The loss of employment and revenue as a result of the confinement between March and May 2020 caused many young Senegalese to attempt to reach the coast of Spain by means of fragile embarkations, thus reviving the sinister Barça or Barzak phenomenon, which is a clandestine, quote unquote, clandestine migration that hit the country in the early 2000s. So the term Barça or Barça is very popular in Senegal, or BWB. And Barça is an abbreviation of Barcelona or Spain. And Barzak derives from the Arabic term, which means purgatory. But in this sense, in the Senegalese context, when you hear the term Barça or Barça, it means try to reach Spain or die trying. So while Senegal and Spain managed to stem the flow of the first wave of BWB migrants by 2010, through coastal patrol, border patrols, international policies, and NGO-related small business loans, the respite was temporary. The current wave showed no signs of slowing down despite heavy aerial and maritime patrols. It seems that the sight of dead bodies, capsized pirogues, and Coast Guard's arrests are not dissuasive enough for many would-be migrants. So in this regard, social activists, musicians, and artists have taken the matter into their own hands to not only raise awareness about the danger of BWB migration or pirogue migration, but also to appeal to the government and elected officials to create jobs and implement more equitable socioeconomic policies. So of course, when dealing with a topic like this, some questions come into mind. Number one, how does this wave of migration differ from the previous one that took place in the early 2000s? How is the government responding to the phenomenon, and how is Senegalese civil society, social movements in particular, reacting to these tragic migration patterns. So in this work or project, we argue that basically COVID-19 has created this new wave of migration because between 2010 and 2020, there was like a respite in these flows of migration. But all of a sudden in 2020, we saw like the numbers increase drastically. And we also argue that because of that, now we have social movements, and we did not see this kind of engagement early in the early 2000s. Social movements are now engaging themselves in this fight to talk to government and elected officials and try to bring some responses to stem the flow of migration. Now, it should be pointed out that when studying pirogue migration in West Africa, there are two main narratives about who the migrants represent and why they migrate. The first argument contends that the pirogue migration is the outcome of overfishing of the Atlantic coast by European, Chinese, and Russian boats. This argument partly rests on the idea that would-be migrants are mostly fishermen or people from fishing communities, and is supported by a large amount of data showing that fishing is an increasingly precarious livelihood in coastal West African nations, particularly in Senegal. In April 2020, GAPES, which is the organization that gathers people in the industrial fishing profession in Senegal, noted that the Senegalese government had planned to deliver 52 fishing licenses to Chinese fishing operations. They also noted that in 2018, close to a dozen licenses were already granted to Chinese industrial fishing companies. These practices, as Amy Potato notes, are common as a way to alleviate budgetary pressures on the government or benefit from illicit payments. More importantly, fearing backlash from Senegalese fishermen, the government encourages Chinese fishing companies to establish businesses inside Senegal. Once a business is established in Senegal, the process of being licensed becomes much less complicated and less controversial. In this case, the foreign company can then apply with the same ease as any Senegalese business. The large fishing trawlers of these companies overfish the already stressed waters. Their daily catch is likewise exported, leaving less for the local population, many of whom rely on fish as a diet staple as well as a livelihood. The second argument concerning migration, or pirogue migration, is advanced by scholars who contend that migration is rather the result of prolonged, generalized economic hardship in the West African region. This argument recognizes that would-be migrant often comes from interior, landlocked regions of West Africa, and in some cases have never even seen the ocean before. In this regard, Aliou Sall and Pierre Morin push back against the idea that a crisis in the fishing industry is a primary factor in pirogue migration. They argue that artisanal fishing in West Africa has experienced a rapid development for half a century now. In Senegal and Mauritania, artisanal fishing continued to yield more than industrial fishing in terms of annual catch. This position is maintained by accounts of migrant candidates who left their homes in the interior of Senegal or neighboring countries for the coast in pursuit of the perceived financial success that immigrating to Europe might provide. Interior regions like Tambacounda in Senegal have paid a heavy price when their youth attempt to migrate, with some families losing multiple members at the same time. Lack of employment opportunities and agricultural equipment combined with the drought have caused a progressive, massive rural exodus in Senegal. The agrarian economy, which already was experiencing substantial difficulties, was further impacted by travel restrictions and curfews, both of which were put in place in April 2020, lifted during the summer months, and renewed as COVID-19 cases began to surge in January 2021. So between September and October 2020, about 500 people perished in the ocean while attempting to reach the Canary Islands. Coastal areas like Moor have seen a surge in departures since the beginning of the pandemic. And as Le Point Afrique has noted, fish were already scarce, but with the pandemic and the state, and I'm quoting here, with the pandemic and the state of emergency, the docks only open a few days per week, and the market, which ordinarily turns the seaside into a bank teeming with men and women in the smell of the ocean, are closed early for prolonged periods. The two distinct reasons for migration or pirogue migration outlined here, the fishing economy and the agrarian economy, intersect as the COVID-19 pandemic has caused major economic downturns and incited people from coastal and landlocked regions, people from rural and urban centers, fishermen and non-fishermen, to be animated by a stronger desire to leave. According to the International Organization for Migration, in the month of October 2020, more than 14 pirogues carrying about 666 migrants left the Senegalese coast for the Canary Islands. A quarter of these embarkations either encountered major issues or simply capsized. Subsequently, the IOM also noted that at least 414 Senegalese died in the ocean the same month, in comparison to 210 fatalities for the entire year of 2019. In the first week of February 2021, the Missing Migrant Project recorded 22 fatalities linked to the Atlantic route to the Canary Islands. And as the pandemic wore on in 2020 and the sea became calmer with the end of the rainy season, migrant departures increased and death rate also followed. And it is in this context that social movements came to action, because like I said earlier, in the first wave, we did not see their involvement really. And then in this wave, now we have movements like Yanamar, for instance, which is a movement that was started in 2011, started to agitate against the policies that the government put in place. So for instance, they organized the March Silencieux, or a silent march, in November 2020, when the number of fatalities reached 480 people. So that's what they called and they created actually a collective called Collective 480 in remembrance to the number of people who lost their lives. And then I'm going to end here. So this is just a chart to show the number of fatalities from 2014 to 2021. And we see clearly in 2021, there was 618 fatalities. And this is from the Missing Migrant Project. And then similarly, we see that in October of 2020, that there is a drastic increase of fatalities when it comes to people attempting to cross the Atlantic Ocean to reach Spain. And here are actually the most recent numbers of when it comes to clandestine or pirogue migration. So in 2020, the Senegalese police was able to stop about 2,300 people from migrating, and they were also able to count the number of pirogues that reached the coast of Spain or the Canary Islands. So 40 pirogues. And these are from the National Police and the Partenariat Operational Function. And I'm gonna leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I'm just gonna get my PowerPoint set up. Maybe. And I'm hoping everybody can hear me okay, also online. I'll try and keep an eye on the Q&A if anybody has trouble hearing me. So thanks again for being here, and thanks to the organizers for putting this event together. It's a really great way to round out the semester. I work at the intersections of critical refugee studies and Italian studies, and I focus on Africa-Europe migration and the Black Mediterranean in the Italian context. So now we're moving from what's often called the Western Mediterranean route in many cases to the Central Mediterranean route, from Bamba's talk to mine. And I'm going to share some insights from my book today, the book in process, which is called Emergency in Transit: Witnessing Mediterranean Migration Beyond Crisis. I'm going to see if my slides can catch up to my, let's see. Oh, there it is. And so in this book, I draw on narrative, literary, and media analysis, and also on ethnographic research that I conducted at reception sites in Italy, so where migrants are housed after they cross the Mediterranean from North Africa, usually in this case from Libya and Tunisia, and where they're housed as their asylum applications are processed. And I'm going to move in pretty broad strokes, so I'm also happy that we will have some time for discussion afterwards. So Emergency in Transit responds to the pervasive framing of migration between Global South and Global North countries in crisis and emergency terms. While media and political actors invoke crisis framings globally, it's these so-called crises in the Global North, so largely in the US, at the US-Mexico border, in Europe, in the Mediterranean, which I'll talk about, and also we've seen recently in the English Channel and also in Australia. These really consume more sustained media coverage, despite that, as refugee studies scholars often cite, in fact, 85% of refugees reside in developing countries. Italy is a key site of transit and arrival for people who cross the Mediterranean Sea in hopes of reaching safety in Europe. So again, crossing from Libya and Tunisia towards southern Italy. And in the Italian context, this also reveals the limits and paradoxes of emergency responses to and emergency framings of migration. So just to show you quickly some of the headlines, just to illustrate that when we talk about migration, we frame it as a crisis. No matter what your view is, it's often, this is the sort of node around which these discourses are constructed. So Italian media and political leaders continue to refer to arrivals by sea as an emergency, which suggests that these arrivals are unprecedented and unexpected, and fix our attention on the now, even though dominant Italian public and political discourse has treated migration as an emergency for more than 3 decades. And as I discuss in more detail in the book, Italy's historical shift from a country of emigration with an E to an immigrant destination also fits within the country's historical north-south divides, its ambiguous position as European, but also as representing Southern Europe, and its lack of reckoning with its own colonial history. I realize I'm making broad generalizations, and we can complicate all of this as well. But in broad terms, this makes it a crucial site for understanding some of the racial tensions at play throughout Europe, and with wider resonances, I think, across contexts in which we can clearly identify precarious migration as a mechanism of racial capitalism. So I focus on the Italian case, and specifically on what I term as the 2014-2019 period that was marked as an immigration emergency there. So beginning around the time when you probably remember seeing news about Syrians crossing into Germany, around that same time, Italy also saw significant increases in arrivals by sea, also of Syrians and Afghans and Iraqis, as well as in the Italian case of people from countries throughout Africa and South Asia. Italy has complained that because of these increases, it has in fact borne the quote unquote burden of Europe's asylum system and border management. And you may have seen this expose recently in the New Yorker about what's happening in detention centers in Libya and how people, as has actually been happening for years, are held there and tortured, and it's a site of extortion and enslavement. These measures are also funded by Italy and the EU. and we can also talk about that in more detail. So focusing on the Italian case and on Africa-Europe migration through Italy, I trace how emergency policies and discourses really operate together to shape people's material experiences. I argue that the recent emergency, I'm going to keep using scare quotes, sorry, took shape around widespread disregard for Italy's colonial history, perpetuated the longstanding racialization of Africans and people of African descent in Italy and their exclusion from the national body, and did so through policies and practices that severely limited the possibilities for people to bear witness to their experiences. And in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus on that last point, so the relationship between emergency and witnessing. Testimony is critical to understanding emergency dynamics for two reasons. First, testimony is the critical genre for asylum seekers and people on the move whose legal status depends on the account they give of the reason why they fled their home country, the reason they've crossed a border, and on the evidence they can provide. And second, emergency itself depends on acts of witnessing. As Janet Reutemann says of crisis, emergency is, in one sense, an observation that produces meaning. How circumstances come to be marked as emergency and the questions we can ask about them depend on that initial observation and the witnessing acts that follow. Responses to emergency depend on ongoing, what I discuss as transactions of testifying and listening, or bearing and becoming witness. And we see this all the time. So-called border emergencies are recognized and managed through a range of testimonial forms, including through direct witnessing acts, as in eyewitness journalistic accounts or migrant authored memoirs, secondary witnessing, for example, news coverage with interview clips, works of literature in which narrators report the testimony of others, or scholarship that reproduces witnessing texts. Testimony is crucial for humanitarian workers who assess risk, public messaging by NGOs, and bureaucratic records that inform government responses. So instances of witnessing abound, but for public consumption, and I'm just showing a few sort of other photos of images that I think about in the project. For public consumption, these witnessing texts are often excerpted without extensive engagement. So I posit that these uses of testimony in widely circulated cultural production, media coverage, and political discourse about migration emergencies often reify the crisis frame, even when they challenge government responses. They reproduce border spectacle and notions of migrant criminality on the one hand, or they underscore suffering and vulnerability. Understanding how emergency operates, so how its operation shapes the lives of people on the move and the communities they arrive to, this requires that we account for multiple forms of testimony, those that feed dominant crisis narratives, and also those that are produced from within crisis. Whose testimony emerges and circulates is crucial for eliciting public and political responses to actual need, for the writing of history, and for imagining alternative futures. So I'll share just a couple of brief examples now, and I'm focusing on this camp in Rome, which was operated by an activist collective called Baobab Experience, which again, I'm happy to say more about. You can also find them online. And I spent several extended visits here. This camp, like others constructed throughout Europe, was home to people who lack access to official reception structures, in particular Africans who had crossed from Libya. This one stood on an asphalt lot near a train station on the east side of the city, and it existed from the spring of 2017 until police finally dismantled it in November 2018. And you can see in some of these images, it was really largely invisible to the outside. But news coverage brought it attention, and the camp became an icon both for migrant rights movements and also a target for right-wing politicians, which is finally what led to its dismantling. Already a space of extreme precarity, the camp was also an object of public suspicion and political animosity, and some witnessing acts perpetuated tensions between camp residents and local communities. In mid-2017, when people could still enter by car, many residents told me that they felt like zoo animals when journalists or locals stopped by for a quick story or out of sheer curiosity. And a couple of times before the city barricaded the perimeter of the camp, I saw cars drive in and slowly circle around, around the area where the tents were and then leave again, kind of crisis voyeurism. Whether coming to gawk or to donate goods, the anticipation of a spectacle of suffering holds a fetishizing appeal, especially in the case of Black suffering in spaces widely understood as white. Several residents pointed out to me how people came to take pictures, then quickly leave, how they came looking for evidence of misery, ignoring that much of the time the camp was quiet, with some people napping or playing games or cutting hair. Some were at appointments in the city or in line for these volunteer doctors who would bring their medical camper in. The voyeur's gaze is a colonial gaze, an observation of otherness that reifies difference and racial hierarchies, producing the camp as a site of encounters in which, drawing on Sarah Ahmed, the migrant is already recognized as a stranger. Media coverage risks reproducing this gaze, depicting migrants through an alien world filtered in through photographs that use images of Black Africans in transit to represent crisis. That colonial imaginary shaped and still shapes ideas of foreignness in Europe and racialized notions of belonging, and the simultaneously widespread refusal to recognize racism as a persistent issue. But the camp is a site of contested witnessing. That same summer, Baobab was home to many Eritreans, and several of these men, when they introduced themselves to me, also immediately cited Eritrea's colonial history. So they said, you know, Eritrea, it was an Italian colony from 1890 to 1941. And one man opened his palms, touching his hands together, saying, Italy and Eritrea are like this, connected. The men's familiarity with Italy and the Italian language was unlikely to lend favor to their cases for asylum, but by citing it, they marked their position within Italian spaces through histories that link them to Italy and its communities. In this testimony within the camp, they claimed a right to be present in Italy, inscribing their presence through colonial relations. Their appeal to history defines their mobility beyond emergency terms and inscribes the camp as a site of colonial memory. In the book, my discussion of this camp also includes a collective diary kept by residents and volunteers. This was initiated by a Tunisian resident and contains entries in multiple languages. So different people would come through and write their story, volunteers and residents alike. And these accounts both document struggle and celebrate the camp as a transnational community and a place where people produce their own practices of hospitality outside the official reception system. This collective testimony represents the camp in ways that counter depictions of such sites as homogeneous spaces of exception or as reproducing an us-them binary. Of course, I don't mean to romanticize the camp, but to point to the critical role of witnessing in both constructing emergency and in challenging the racialized and nation-centered views of mobility and belonging that emergency reifies. If witnessing crisis often upholds notions of migration as crisis, and if these emergency framings perpetuate precarity rather than resolve it, then what forms of witnessing might, like this notebook and individual testimonials, offer another way of framing migration or recognizing people on the move outside the crisis labels imposed on them? So in the book, I turn to a range of oral, written, and visual texts moving from the sea to reception centers and camps like the one that I've talked about here. And I go on then to urban and rural sites where migrants are using testimonial forms to lead anti-racist and rights movements, just to give you a sense of where it goes. I'm happy to take questions, and thanks again so much.
Thank you very much. Our speaker, Dr. Grace Tran.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to pull up my slides very quickly here. Well, thank you so much for having me, and to the organizers for making this all possible. I think what the amazing presentations that have come before me have really highlighted is that with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the tangible, material, and abstract benefits of access to the global north, to more developed quote unquote countries has never been more obvious, and the stakes have never been higher. With this in mind, I'll be presenting a part of my book manuscript entitled Laws of Love, and my presentation today is called What's Love Got to Do with It? Transformative Effects of Vietnamese American Engagement in Marriage Fraud Arrangements. To begin with, I wanted to introduce a brief anecdote of how I got started in my research in the first place. I'd like to take you back with me to 2014 when I was an undergraduate student who was convinced that her vocation was to be a romance novelist and to write love stories, ironically. So like every aspiring romance novelist, what I did was that I started people watching at a coffee shop a couple of times a week, the same coffee shop in Toronto, Ontario. And what resulted in that was me meeting Hien. Hien was a fast-paced, fast-talking, sharply dressed Vietnamese Canadian woman in her late 50s. And what really interested me about her was that she was constantly switching back and forth between two phones, one in which she spoke in hushed tones and the other in which she spoke in normal tones. When I finally summoned up enough courage to ask her what she did for a living, Hien told me that what she did was sold custom furniture. I had no reason to doubt her, so I didn't question it. But as the months passed and we built and developed rapport with each other, she eventually asked me if I wanted to know what she really did for work, to which she responded, I arranged Dam Cơ Ya for a living. I never heard of the term Dam Cơ Ya before, and so when I asked her to elaborate, this is what Hien told me. Dam Cơ in Vietnamese means wedding, and Ya means fake. Put together, it refers to fake weddings. So as I soon learned from Hien, she was not just a broker, but one of the most established and prominent brokers in the Vietnamese community of Dam Cơ Ya arrangements. What Hien did was she went out and recruited Vietnamese Canadian men to go back to Vietnam for an agreed upon sum of, I'm not sure what that is. Sorry, let me correct my slides. Because they're amazing. Thank you. Great. Okay, does that work? Yeah. Okay, great. So what Hien did, as I mentioned, was go recruit Vietnamese Canadian men for agreed upon sum of $30,000 to $70,000 to go back to Vietnam and marry a Vietnamese woman, bring her over to Canada for permanent residency. And it was considered a no strings attached contractual deal in which once the Vietnamese woman secured permanent residency, the couple would then file for divorce and proceed to go on with their lives as though nothing happened. Taking this into account, Hien's involvement in Dam Cơ Ya is congruous with the Canadian government's definition of marriage fraud. Any marriage or common law relationship whose sole purpose is to let the sponsored spouse or partner immigrate to Canada. In fact, the Canadian government is so weary of this concept of marriage fraud that it introduced a nationwide anti-marriage fraud campaign in 2012. In 2015, Canada's largest newspaper, the Toronto Star, leaked an immigration officials guide that was never meant to see the public eye. And in this officials guide, immigration officers were advised through evaluating spousal sponsorship applications of red flags to look for cross-border applications of married couples. These red flags included couples who do not kiss on the lips, wedding photos that lack family and friends, receptions that take place at a Chinese banquet hall, an absence of diamond rings, and photos of the couple taken in their pajamas at home making breakfast at the CN Tower or the Niagara Falls, because they were seen as too voyeuristic, too touristy, and too obviously staged. So as we can see here, this concept of marriage fraud really could not exist without the concept of what constitutes a real, legitimate, authentic marriage, and what also constitutes as real, authentic intimacy and love. Although the Canadian government's regulation or phrasing of anti-marriage fraud regulations is seen as neutral, the ways that it unfolds is anything but. So against this policy landscape, I asked some research questions. How do immigration policies govern both citizens and non-citizens' intimate lives? What strategies do cross-border couples rely on to present themselves as convincingly real enough to merit access to state membership? And what are the costs and transformative effects of participating in marriage fraud? The methods that I used include 3 years of fieldwork across Vietnam, Canada, and the US, taking me through public and private spaces, as well as participant observation and 16 months of deeply embedded ethnography. Again, this is a very cursory discussion. I'm happy to launch into a more detailed discussion during the Q&A of my positionality and my methods. But as my role at an immigration law and consulting firm allowed me to do, as an immigration case specialist, I helped cross-border couples daily navigate the immigration process, putting together their spousal sponsorship applications. And that provided me with a firsthand account and witnessing of how immigration policy unfolds in policy and in practice. I introduced one of the theoretical contributions that I make in my book manuscript, which is strategic intimacies. And I define this as the deliberate and purposeful performance of intimacy, reflecting idealized models of love and marriage undertaken by individuals who must draw on social and economic capital to navigate securitized border regimes. And it's worth noting here that strategic intimacies are not drawn on just by couples in fake or damgaya arrangements. They're drawn on by couples who do believe that they're genuinely in love and frame their relationship as that as well, because the government by necessity requires such a linear way of documenting and proving cross-border relationships and intimacy. Through interviewing immigration officers, damgaya participants, brokers, and immigration officials, I encountered several patterns or strategies, strategic intimacies, especially used in the damgaya participant community. As he noted, she and the damgaya participants that she worked with often hired someone, a penman, they called it for hire, who would write postcards and love letters to imitate the initial stages of courtship. Moreover, there were staged phone call logs. So one participant I interviewed and met with, Tan, actually recalled that he had no interest in the Vietnamese woman he was sponsoring over as a spouse. He wanted to be single and mingle, so he would call her a couple times a week, and he would leave the phone on the bed, go out to the club, come home at 3 a.m. And on the call logs, it looked as though they were really getting to know each other every evening, imitating the stages of a courtship and familiarity in a cross-border relationship. There are also staged photographs, so damgaya photographers for hire who know how to stage couples and highlight their physical displays of affection, stage wedding receptions, ceremonies, and honeymoons, rented banquet halls, guests and family members for hire, rented ao dai, so traditional Vietnamese attire, as well as rented westernized white wedding dresses and tuxedos, and fake wedding rings and wedding ring tans. What I found the most interesting was this emphasis on a wedding ring tan. So a lot of damgaya participants I spoke to said that they would wear a fake wedding ring around long enough to get a tan so that when they spoke to immigration officials who interviewed them, they could play around with the ring like this and show the fact that they had been together long enough that there was no way this relationship cannot be real. So wedding ring tans really serve as a temporal testament and proof of the longevity of the relationship. Towards what I thought was the end of my relationship, the end of my fieldwork, I met with Kimmy, a participant in damgaya, and I knew little about her other than that she had been sponsored as a spouse from Vietnam. She secured permanent residency about a year ago and was in her early 20s. And when I asked her, because we met on Valentine's Day, whether she had met anyone that she had developed romantic attachments for after living in Canada for a year, she surprised me with her response. Kimmy said, yes, the man who pretended to marry me so I can come here. I guess you can say we're dating after marriage. So Kimmy actually developed real romantic attachments to the man, Guop, who chose to marry her to Canada. They actually restaged their wedding and had a bigger wedding than their fake one. He bought her a bigger diamond ring, and they're now expecting their first child together. When I asked Kimmy what made her fall in love with Guop, she said that their first attempts at staging romantic photos were rebuked by the damgaya broker, who said, real Canadian couples don't kiss on the cheek. They're not afraid to kiss on the lips, so go back and take those photos again. Kimmy was nervous because she never kissed a man on the lips before. And she recalled that Guop took her hand and said, Am, what is your favorite romance movie? For this picture, we just pretend to be in that movie. Don't worry. I saw how Guop is sweet and he'd take good care of me. When I kiss him, it is not a bad first kiss. From that, I start to think he would make a real good husband. So my key findings are that the deployment of strategic intimacies has irreversible transformative effects on participants' lives, affecting the identities and intimate relationships that they have with others. Moreover, what looks like resistance can be reinforcement, right? So purchasing, for instance, a bigger diamond ring, wearing a white westernized wedding dress, they can reinforce idealized notions of love and marriage at the same time as damgaya brokers resist border regimes. However, what looks like reinforcement can also be resistance. So in purchasing these props and engaging in manufactured intimacy and deploying strategic intimacy, damgaya participants resist securitized border regimes by pointing to the porousness of these border regimes as a whole. In conclusion, the messiness of intimate relationships fails to fit neatly into the logics of nation states and migration policies, and anti-marriage fraud regulations are far from neutral. As we can see, they unfold under highly classed, gendered, heteronormative, and racialized lines. So the implications of this are that borders shape and are shaped by the concept of marriage fraud. And the central paradox that emerges from my research and in my book manuscript is that in regulating for marriage fraud, the Canadian government sets the conditions for damkaya arrangements and others like it to grow into something real, thus blurring the lines between real and fake marriage. I end here with a quote from Kimmy, who expressed frustration with this dichotomy between real and fake. She said, "My first fake kiss with Book is my first real kiss. I never kissed a boy before, never. If Book and I are in real love now, and that as a relationship is real, then even if our damkaya is not, why it is a crime." So once again, just reiterating that when you pay close attention to these binaries between real and fake, they end up deconstructing themselves when we pay closer empirical and theoretical attention to them. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to everybody, the presenters and the audiences in person and the virtual audience for your engagement, and have a lovely, wonderful weekend in 2 days.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.